February 1945. The Ardennes forest still smolders from weeks of fighting. A thin mist curls through the burned trunks, and the distant thud of retreating engines fades into silence. Across a snow-laced ridge, a group of German tank commanders watches the valley below, their once-feared Panthers crouched like steel beasts in the fog. They've fought through artillery before. They've endured barrages that shook the earth. But what they see now is something different. A line of American guns flashes without warning. No high-arching shells, no whistling descent. Instead, a streak of fire tears through the mist, a hiss more than a roar, vanishing into the valley floor. Then, a detonation so violent it seems to come from beneath the tanks themselves. One vehicle lifts, collapses, and disappears into smoke. The crews stare in disbelief. These aren't the shells they know. They move too fast, burn too bright, and strike with impossible precision. For the first time, fear creeps through the armored corps, a fear that their armor no longer protects them. And as confusion spreads across the radio net, one question echoes. What are those rockets? The answer lay months earlier, in the quiet laboratories and test ranges of the American arsenal. By late 1944, the balance of firepower in Europe was shifting. The German Wehrmacht, once unmatched in armored warfare, was now on the defensive across two fronts. In the west, Allied forces had crossed France after Normandy and were pressing toward the Rhine. Every mile cost blood, steel, and shell casings. American infantry divisions relied heavily on artillery, the silent giant of their advance. To the Germans who faced it, the thunder of American guns became a constant, inescapable presence. The United States Army's artillery was already a logistical marvel. Self-propelled guns like the M7 Priest and M12 GMC could move, fire, and position before German counter-batteries could respond. But as German armor thickened and urban fighting compressed distances, even conventional 155mm and 105mm shells sometimes lacked the velocity to destroy tanks before they struck back. Reports from the Battle of the Bulge told of Panthers surviving near misses and retreating unscathed. Commanders demanded something faster, something that hit harder, flatter, and farther. American ordnance engineers had been experimenting quietly since 1943 with a radical idea: rocket propulsion for artillery shells. The concept wasn't entirely new. Britain had its 60-pound RP-3 rockets for aircraft, and the Germans themselves had the terrifying Nebelwerfer launchers. But the U.S. sought precision, not saturation. Their focus was the rocket-assisted projectile, or RAP, a shell that could be fired from a standard gun, its rocket motor igniting mid-flight to extend range and velocity. At first, the results were unpredictable. Propellants burned unevenly, casings ruptured, and range tables proved useless. Yet by early 1944, test groups at Aberdeen Proving Ground had produced a shell that could travel over 30 kilometers from a 155mm long tom. Field trials impressed planners of the U.S. First Army who saw immediate potential, a way to hit German armor concentrations long before they approached the front line. As Allied air power hammered supply routes and bridges, German tank battalions began moving under cover of darkness, relying on wooded terrain and speed. American forward observers struggled to spot and relay coordinates fast enough. The RAP concept offered a countermeasure: fewer rounds needed, greater reach, and shock value that standard high-explosive shells couldn't match. Meanwhile, intelligence reports from captured German engineers hinted that the enemy was fielding more advanced armor, the Tiger II, the Jag Tiger, even experimental vehicles with frontal armor exceeding 180 millimeters. In a contest of penetration and range, the Americans knew conventional shells were nearing their limits. Thus, rocket propulsion was not just innovation, it was necessity. By the autumn of 1944, small consignments of the new rocket-assisted rounds reached selected artillery battalions attached to the Third Army under Patton and to the First Army near Aachen. Strict secrecy surrounded the tests. The project was officially listed under Ordnance Development Extended Range 155mm, with no mention of rockets. Crews received brief instructions: load, fire, observe, record. On December 22, 1944, during the Ardennes counteroffensive, one of these test batteries near Elsenborn Ridge fired the weapon in combat for the first time. Observers noted an unusual streak, bright, low, and almost horizontal. Seconds later, an explosion tore apart a German column that had believed itself beyond American range. The next morning, prisoners described shells that came without warning, like lightning. These reports raced up the chain of command. At SHAEF headquarters, staff officers debated whether to authorize broader use. Some feared revealing the technology before production could meet demand. Others saw an opportunity to cripple German armor morale. In the end, practical need won. By January 1945, shipments of rocket-assisted ammunition increased, and special handling crews were trained to manage their volatile propellant loads. Unbeknownst to German intelligence, the battlefield equation was about to change. Tank commanders accustomed to calculating safe distances behind terrain contours would soon discover that even retreating 2 miles beyond known American gun range was no longer enough. It was in those frozen valleys of Belgium and Western Germany that rumors began. The whispers of rocket shells that no lookout could spot and no armor could resist. And those whispers, carried across radio channels and trench lines, reached the ears of the very men inside the Panthers and Tigers. The fear that spread among German tank crews in early 1945 did not emerge from nowhere. It was the result of months of quiet evolution inside the vast American war machine. The United States had spent the better part of the war perfecting the science of firepower logistics, how to deliver more explosives, more accurately, faster than any army in history. Artillery was the foundation of that effort. But by late 1944, the race for innovation had reached a breaking point. In Washington, the Ordnance Department's laboratories were overflowing with experimental ideas: variable fuses, composite propellants, spin-stabilized rockets. The RAP program, Rocket-Assisted Projectile, was just one of many, but it was the only one that promised a leap rather than an improvement. If successful, it would make the old laws of range and trajectory obsolete. Engineers at the Picatinny Arsenal refined the motor section, learning to inject the rocket propellant behind a reinforced plate to prevent chamber explosions. At Dugway and Aberdeen, test gunners charted the unpredictable flight paths that came with uneven thrust. The rocket motor would not ignite until the shell had cleared the barrel, giving the weapon a strange two-stage personality. First, the heavy recoil of a standard gun, then a few seconds later the bright burn of a secondary flame high in the sky. Observers described it as a comet trailing a thunderclap. By autumn 1944, the Army's technical services began to standardize the new shell under controlled designations: RAP T-80 for the 155mm and RAP T-22 for the 105mm. Both could be fired from existing guns, though their trajectories required fresh firing tables and recalibrated sights. A handful of ordnance officers quietly trained select units in their use. Their instructions were clear: no discussion, no field demonstration, no press. Even among frontline artillery crews, few knew they were handling a rocket weapon. Meanwhile, across the lines, the Wehrmacht was suffering from its own technological exhaustion. German engineers had created fearsome weapons, the V-2 rocket, the Panther, the Tiger, but could no longer mass-produce or supply them effectively. Fuel shortages strangled operations. Experienced tank crews were irreplaceable. In that environment, uncertainty became deadly. When a German platoon commander couldn't explain why a tank had been destroyed from an impossible range, rumor filled the void. The first after-action reports describing rocket shells came not from Allied troops but from German signals intercepts. Wehrmacht records from January 1945 mention projectiles of unusual trajectory and luminous trail observed in engagements near Monschau and Prüm. One message, sent by a field officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division, described the shells as fast as aircraft rockets, but fired from guns of the enemy's artillery. By then, American batteries were refining their use. Forward observers learned to exploit the extended range, using the shells to target enemy staging areas rather than front-line trenches. One artillery officer from the 2nd Infantry Division later wrote that it felt like borrowing power from the future. The shells burned bright enough at ignition to be seen even in daylight, a surreal sight on the European battlefield where almost every weapon's path was hidden. The psychological impact outpaced the physical results. In truth, the rocket-assisted rounds were not mass-produced in sufficient quantity to change the entire front. Only a fraction of American artillery units ever used them. But to German troops who witnessed their effect, they seemed omnipresent. The illusion of an unstoppable long-range weapon began to erode confidence. Commanders delayed advances. Armored units spent more time concealed. Some even requested night-only movements, fearful of being spotted by an enemy whose guns now reached impossible distances. It was a textbook case of technological shock, the moment when the perception of a weapon becomes as potent as the weapon itself. In the weeks that followed, American fire missions combined the new rocket-assisted rounds with proximity-fused shells, creating what observers described as walls of flame. It wasn't that the rockets were always deadly, it was that they arrived before anyone realized they were coming. By early February, the German High Command had begun issuing field memoranda advising tank formations to avoid known artillery arcs beyond 25 kilometers, a futile measure given that those arcs had just expanded. The front had changed in ways few understood. The science behind it was barely a year old, but its psychological reach was immediate. The Americans had stumbled upon something that rewrote the fear calculus of mechanized war. And that fear, raw, creeping, and invisible, would reveal itself most brutally in the next phase, when the angles of technology, leadership, and survival collided on the battlefield. War has many faces, and every innovation in its machinery reflects one of them. The rocket-assisted artillery shell was not just a weapon, it was a mirror showing how technology, psychology, and desperation converged in the final year of the Second World War. From the eyes of the soldier, the engineer, the commander, and even the enemy, each saw the same flame, but understood it differently. For the German tank crews of 1945, the battlefield had long been a place of predictable terror. They knew the whistle of incoming shells, the shockwave of near hits, the discipline of seeking cover. But when the first rocket-propelled shells struck, something broke in that rhythm. Tank commanders described seeing streaks of light that moved faster than they could react. To veterans trained to calculate artillery arcs by ear and instinct, these attacks felt supernatural. Inside the cramped hulls of Tigers and Panthers, men could hear nothing but the rising hiss of incoming fire, a sound unlike anything before. Reports recovered after the war spoke of shells that did not travel through the air but arrived by lightning. Even hardened veterans of Kursk or Normandy admitted they felt powerless. A Tiger commander from the 9th Panzer Division later recalled that, "We stopped trusting the ground itself." The effect was psychological before it was physical. The shells didn't always penetrate armor. Often they detonated close enough to disable tracks or set fuel ablaze. But the violence of impact, the speed of arrival, and the eerie flame trail instilled panic. Commanders began to doubt their own maps, wondering if any distance was safe. For young recruits rushed into service during those desperate months, morale cracked quickly. They no longer felt shielded by their armor. Instead, their tanks became iron coffins. The battlefield had evolved faster than human nerves could adapt. From the American perspective, the rocket-assisted projectile was a tool to rewrite battlefield geometry. Traditional artillery had limits. The further the target, the higher the arc, the greater the flight time, and the longer the warning. Rocket propulsion changed all of that. When the propellant ignited mid-flight, the shell's velocity surged, its arc flattened, its travel time shortened, and its accuracy at long range improved. Forward observers could now call fire missions on enemy columns retreating far beyond previous limits. This meant one crucial thing: German tank formations could no longer stage safely behind ridgelines or in defilade. Areas once used as protected assembly points suddenly fell within reach. American commanders exploited this ruthlessly, firing into wooded valleys and crossroads hours before assaults began. Tactically, this innovation blurred the line between field artillery and long-range strike capability. It allowed American batteries to harass, disrupt, and scatter enemy units before contact. German counter-battery units, used to tracking the slow parabolic arcs of incoming shells, found nothing: no time, no trace, no pattern. During the Siegfried Line battles, entire armored companies were forced to relocate because American fire was reported landing beyond possible map range. These delays, compounded across multiple sectors, slowed German movements and crippled their coordination. The real tactical power of the rocket-assisted shell wasn't just its reach. It was the chaos it sowed in the enemy's timing. Every delay meant fewer tanks at the front when they were most needed. And in the fast, fluid warfare of 1945, timing was everything. In laboratories and test fields, American engineers saw something else entirely. The rocket-assisted projectile represented a transition point, a stepping stone between traditional artillery and guided missile technology. It was the first serious attempt to merge ballistic and rocket science within a single weapon. Unlike the German Nebelwerfer or V-2, which were standalone rockets, the American RAP used existing artillery infrastructure. It could be fired from the same guns, handled by the same crews, but achieved a range and impact previously unimaginable. The concept was deceptively simple: extend range through rocket thrust without redesigning the gun. Yet the engineering challenges were immense, balancing propellant burn, ensuring stability during transition, and preventing catastrophic failures during ignition. When it worked, it offered glimpses of the future. Data gathered from these wartime experiments would later shape Cold War artillery and even early surface-to-surface missiles. The rocket-assisted projectile blurred lines between the known and the next. By 1945, the U.S. Army understood that war was evolving into a contest of velocity and precision. The RAP was not perfect. It was expensive, inconsistent, and fragile. But it revealed that the future battlefield would belong to propulsion, not powder. For generals and field officers, the introduction of rocket-propelled munitions brought a different kind of tension: command risk. Eisenhower's staff knew that revealing any new technology invited countermeasures. Patton, famously impatient, argued for immediate use, claiming that a weapon on the shelf helps no soldier in the field. Others feared the unknown. Would the rockets malfunction under combat conditions? Could captured rounds reveal secrets? The decision to deploy them at Elsenborn and Aachen came down to urgency. The Ardennes counteroffensive was draining resources, and conventional artillery alone couldn't break through entrenched positions fast enough. Once the shells proved effective, command enthusiasm surged. Reports from frontline corps showed dramatic morale boosts among American gunners. They felt they'd been handed something revolutionary, a taste of overwhelming firepower. Leadership, however, faced a paradox. The very secrecy that protected the project limited its use. Only select batteries received ammunition, and their success led others to request rounds that didn't exist in sufficient numbers. Commanders had to ration both shells and information. In this tension between power and scarcity, the weapon gained mystique, even among allies who had never seen it fired. By the spring of 1945, as Allied guns moved closer to the Rhine, the weapon's reputation had outgrown its numbers. To German tankers, it was the invisible reach of American artillery. To U.S. engineers, it was the seed of modern warfare. But on the battlefield itself, amid mud, fire, and exhaustion, it became something else entirely: the sound of inevitability. And that inevitability would soon erupt in full view when the weapon's true power was demonstrated in the decisive moments ahead. For the German command, the sudden appearance of rocket-propelled shells was a mystery. Wrapped in panic, intelligence officers first dismissed field reports of rocket artillery as confusion with Allied air attacks. But as more units confirmed the same observations, disbelief gave way to alarm. German doctrine had long depended on the concept of Feuerüberlegenheit, fire superiority. The Wehrmacht's early war success rested on coordination between armor, artillery, and air support. By 1945, that balance was gone. The Luftwaffe was crippled, and German artillery batteries were constantly outgunned. Still, tank divisions took comfort in the precision of their heavy guns and the thickness of their armor. The appearance of rocket shells shattered that illusion. Captured radio logs from the 6th Panzer Army described shells that struck without the usual delay or arc. At first, officers suspected hidden rocket batteries or aircraft-delivered ordnance. When reconnaissance revealed only standard American artillery positions, confusion deepened. If the Americans could extend their range so drastically, then every staging area, every fuel dump, every movement corridor was vulnerable. Within weeks, German counter-battery fire grew erratic. Some units wasted ammunition trying to silence phantom guns firing from impossible distances. Others relocated their artillery too far back to be effective. Commanders wrote in frustration that our maps no longer protect us. Fear became systemic. Armored crews began to avoid certain sectors altogether. The once proud panzer divisions that had spearheaded blitzkrieg across Europe were now moving cautiously, second-guessing their training. In warfare, hesitation is fatal, and hesitation, not explosions, began destroying the Wehrmacht's armor from within. War is not only measured in weapons and victories, but in what it does to the men who wield those weapons. The rocket-assisted artillery shell, while an engineering triumph, revealed something darker about humanity's race toward destruction. Each new weapon in the Second World War, from radar-guided bombs to jet aircraft, shall push the boundary of distance between killer and killed. The RAP was another step on that path. Artillerymen no longer saw their targets. They struck enemies miles beyond the horizon, guided only by coordinates and trust in physics. The rockets made killing easier to execute and harder to comprehend. To German soldiers, this was a terrifying reminder that war had become mechanical and impersonal. They could not see the gunner, could not anticipate the shot, and could not defend against it. For the Americans, it was a strength. Empowerment, the ability to end battles faster and with fewer losses. Yet it also bred a numbness, a detachment that foreshadowed the technological wars of the future. The moral weight of these innovations lingered long after the guns fell silent. Post-war reflections by American ordnance officers often carried a tone of unease. One engineer wrote, "We built a bridge between science and destruction, and crossed it before we asked what waited on the other side." The rocket-assisted shell was not a weapon of mass destruction, but it was part of the psychological shift that defined modern warfare. Distance without empathy, efficiency without emotion. Behind every weapon of 1945 stood the machinery of an entire nation. The success of the rocket artillery program was as much about logistics as invention. The U.S. had built an industrial engine so vast that it could afford to experiment even while fighting a global war. Factories in Illinois, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania retooled to produce propellant grains, steel casings, and fuse assemblies. The key breakthrough came when manufacturers developed stable, slow-burning rocket propellants that could survive months in field storage without degrading. By late 1944, production had scaled enough to arm a select number of divisions, a quiet triumph of industrial planning. Germany, by contrast, had innovation without capacity. Its engineers conceived wonders, jet fighters, heavy tanks, ballistic missiles, but lacked the raw materials and time to mass-produce them. America had both. The rocket-assisted artillery shell embodied that contrast, a practical weapon born of incremental engineering and massive supply lines. Each crate of shells shipped to Europe represented not just technology, but the combined labor of thousands of machinists, chemists, and factory workers back home. It was the material expression of industrial democracy overwhelming the centralized genius of the Reich. At the highest levels of Allied command, the rocket-assisted artillery program fit into a broader vision of total fire dominance. The U.S. Army's evolving doctrine emphasized coordination between artillery, armor, and air power to maintain uninterrupted pressure on the enemy. Rocket shells extended that reach, ensuring that no German unit could regroup safely. This idea would outlast the war itself. In the decades that followed, the lessons learned from these late-war experiments shaped NATO's artillery philosophy: longer reach, quicker response, and technology-driven precision. The first Cold War-era rocket artillery systems, the Honest John, the Corporal missile, owed their lineage to those early 155mm rocket-assisted shells. In that sense, the winter of 1945 was more than a closing chapter of the war. It was the prelude to the modern battlefield. The same print, sipples of range, propulsion, and shock that terrified German tank commanders would soon define the doctrine of every superpower. By the time Allied forces reached the Rhine, German intelligence had pieced together what had happened. Reports concluded that the Americans had developed hybrid rocket projectiles fired from normal artillery. It was too late for countermeasures. The weapon's psychological campaign had already done its work. Yet even as the front collapsed, another battle was unfolding. One not of fear, but of fate. Because when the rockets finally reached full deployment in the field, they would strike at the very core of Germany's defensive line. And in that moment, the abstract science of propulsion would meet the brutal reality of war. When the first rocket artillery salvos struck, the shock went far beyond physical destruction. It was psychological, a weapon that struck not just the body but the mind. Soldiers described the sound as a scream from hell, a noise that started low and built into a tearing roar that made the ground vibrate. It wasn't like conventional shelling, where men could brace between explosions or gauge the distance of incoming rounds. These came in waves, dozens, sometimes hundreds at once, all landing in seconds. There was no rhythm, no warning, no pause to catch breath. German veterans who faced Soviet Katyusha fire on the Eastern Front had nicknamed them Stalin's organs for their screaming launch sounds. Now in 1944 and 1945, the Americans and British had their own versions. The M8 and M16 launchers mounted on half-tracks, and the terrifying British land mattress that unleashed 60-pound rockets in dense saturation. They didn't have the range or precision of heavy artillery, but they had something else: shock value. In the chaos of the battlefield, sound alone could break formations. Infantrymen caught under rocket fire often froze, unable to think clearly. Officers struggled to issue orders amid the concussive roar. Even when the rockets didn't hit directly, the overwhelming noise and shock waves shattered morale. Men described it as the closest thing to facing the end of the world. German reports from the Ardennes and the Rhine crossings show this effect clearly. Units pinned by rocket salvos often failed to regroup or counterattack. Communications broke down, tanks reversed into cover, fearing another strike. Forward observers reported that after a single barrage, entire sections of woodland were completely silent, as if life had been erased. The U.S. Army quickly recognized this psychological power. Commanders began to use rocket artillery less as precision weapons and more as tools of intimidation and disruption. Before an infantry assault, they would order rocket batteries to fire a concentrated, thunderous salvo, not necessarily to destroy specific targets, but to make the enemy believe annihilation was coming. One soldier later said, "When the Calliope opened up, it sounded like all the demons of war had been let loose." The M4 Sherman Calliope system, mounted with 60 rockets on its turret, became one of the most visually and orally terrifying sights of the war. Watching dozens of streaks arc from a tank into the sky, it was a surreal moment, like seeing an entire section of the battlefield light up with fire trails. In one recorded engagement near Cologne, a single Calliope tank fired its entire load into a cluster of German buildings thought to hold anti-tank crews. The result was devastation: roofs torn off, walls collapsing, vehicles overturned. But beyond the destruction, what followed was silence. German troops who survived fled deeper into the ruins, abandoning their guns. When the U.S. infantry advanced minutes later, they found the streets empty. The British 21st Army Group used their land mattress rocket batteries with similar psychological strategy. These weapons were crude in design, simple tubes welded to frames, but could unleash massive salvos in seconds. During the Battle of the Scheldt, Canadian units used them to clear entrenched German positions in flooded terrain. Survivors described the barrages as unbearable, shaking every nerve. Even hardened veterans were shaken by the experience. A German officer captured after a land mattress strike admitted that his men refused to return to the front line afterward, convinced that the enemy had a new gas weapon. That fear, irrational, uncontrollable, was the true value of rocket artillery. It was not just a new weapon, it was a psychological revolution in warfare. Unlike traditional artillery, which fired at predictable intervals and could be located by counter-battery fire, rockets struck suddenly and then vanished. The launchers themselves could relocate in minutes, leaving behind only smoking racks. German spotters would try to trace the origin, but by the time counterfire arrived, the battery was gone, already miles away, ready to strike again. This mobility made them the perfect ghost weapons. American M8 launchers could be towed by jeeps or mounted on trucks. The Calliope could fire and move immediately afterward. The German Nebelwerfer, though less mobile, could still shift quickly enough to evade retaliation. For the soldiers under fire, it was maddening. They couldn't pinpoint where the attacks came from. They couldn't prepare. They couldn't predict. And perhaps most importantly, they couldn't forget. The sound of rockets haunted soldiers long after the barrages ended. Even days later, men would flinch at the crackle of distant fire or the hiss of a passing aircraft. Psychologists studying battlefield stress after the war found that veterans who endured rocket artillery bombardments displayed higher signs of trauma and exhaustion than those who experienced conventional shelling. This made rocket artillery more than just a tactical weapon. It became a weapon of fear management. The U.S. and British militaries learned that simply positioning rocket batteries where the enemy might detect them was enough to shape behavior. German reconnaissance often reported heavy rocket concentrations in areas where no such units existed, forcing commanders to divert troops and spread thin their defenses. By late 1944, Allied intelligence began planting false reports of mass rocket forces along the front, amplifying that fear. The real number of rocket launchers was limited, but the psychological effect multiplied tenfold. German soldiers would later recall how rumors spread faster than facts. "We believed every tree could hide a launcher," one wrote. "When the rockets came, you didn't think paved, you just prayed." This mental erosion aligned with broader Allied strategy. As air superiority and mechanized warfare tightened around Germany, morale became a target as valuable as fuel or ammunition. The rocket artillery, it perfectly into this approach, a symbol of overwhelming, uncontrollable power. In many ways, it prefigured modern warfare. The emphasis on psychological dominance, shock, awe, sudden strikes, foreshadowed how militaries would later design air campaigns, missile systems, and even nuclear deterrence strategies. The rocket had become a message as much as a weapon. By early 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, rocket batteries often opened major offensives. Before Operation Plunder, the crossing at Wesel, hundreds of rocket launchers fired in unison. The sky glowed red for miles. One observer described it as a man-made sunrise. The barrage drowned out every other sound on the battlefield. The Germans, already weakened, had no countermeasure. The following morning, when British and American troops advanced, resistance was minimal. Entire sections of German defense lines had simply disintegrated. Commanders attributed this not solely to physical damage, but to psychological paralysis. The defenders, they noted, had lost the will to fight. Even as the war neared its end, the echo of these weapons lingered. Soldiers on both sides would never forget the terrifying wail of rockets, a sound that would later inspire both innovation and dread in the Cold War to come. The impact of rocket artillery wasn't measured just in craters or casualties. It was measured in silence, the kind that followed after the last echoes faded, when men looked at the destruction and realized how quickly power had changed. It was a silence that marked the beginning of a new era. Because in that moment, amid the shattered forests and smoking cities, the world had witnessed not just a new kind of weapon, but the first glimpse of modern warfare's future. Speed, fear, and devastation delivered in seconds. And as history would soon prove, once the rocket had been unleashed, there was no going back. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a wasteland of twisted steel and shattered cities. The echoes of war faded slowly, but one sound seemed to linger in memory longer than the rest: the rising scream of rockets. It haunted the veterans who had heard it, fascinated the scientists who had built it, and reshaped the imagination of every military planner who would fight the next war. World War II had begun with horses, rifles, and biplanes. It ended with jet aircraft, guided bombs, and weapons that blurred the line between artillery and aviation. The rocket, once dismissed as an unreliable novelty, had proven itself. It could terrify armies, pulverize defenses, and shift the psychological balance of battle. But most of all, it had revealed something deeper. The future of warfare would belong to speed, shock, and reach. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied engineers scoured Europe for rocket technology. The race for rocket scientists began even before Germany surrendered. Under the secretive Operation Paperclip, the United States recruited hundreds of German engineers, including Werner von Braun, the mind behind the V-2 ballistic missile, the world's first long-range rocket weapon. These men were transported to America, where they would shape not just military weapons, but the future of space exploration. The irony was striking. The same technology that once rained destruction on London would now lift satellites, astronauts, and dreams into orbit. But that duality, between war and progress, was the essence of the rocket's legacy. Every breakthrough carried the memory of what had come before: the fires of Normandy, the ruins of Warsaw, the thunder of the Ardennes. Meanwhile, military leaders around the world studied the lessons of rocket artillery: the American Calliope and T-27 xylophone, the British land mattress, the Soviet Katyusha, and the German Nebelwerfer had all demonstrated one undeniable truth: massed rocket fire could overwhelm the enemy's senses in ways conventional guns could not. It was fast, mobile, and devastating. By 1946, the U.S. Army had begun redesigning its entire artillery doctrine around these principles. New rocket launchers like the M16 Whiz-Bang and post-war successors were tested, while the Soviets, who had relied heavily on their Katyusha regiments, made rockets the foundation of their artillery corps. The Red Army expanded production, creating larger, more sophisticated systems capable of firing hundreds of projectiles in coordinated salvos. It was here, in the ashes of the Second World War, that the lineage of the modern multiple-launch rocket system, the MLRS, was born. Every launcher that came after, from the Soviet BM-21 Grad to the American M270, traced its ancestry back to those chaotic, fiery nights in Europe. But technology was only part of the story. The other half was human memory. For the soldiers who lived through rocket bombardments, the war had changed forever. They had seen what it meant to face destruction that came not in single shells but in storms. They had felt the earth shudder, the air burn, and the world disappear in seconds. That experience reshaped military psychology. Commanders began to understand that breaking the enemy's will was often more effective than breaking his body. This realization became doctrine. In Korea, Vietnam, and later in the Middle East, rocket artillery was used as a tool of terror and suppression, just as it had been in Europe. The sound, that rising, tearing scream, returned again and again. Soldiers who had never seen World War II still described the same fear, the same paralysis, the same disbelief. Yet for all its power, rocket artillery remained a double-edged sword. It could devastate but not discriminate. Civilian areas caught in the crossfire suffered horribly. Villages, towns, even refugee columns were obliterated in seconds. The world that emerged after 1945 began to question whether such weapons, which highly militarily effective, could ever be morally justified. That moral question followed every innovation thereafter. When ballistic missiles began to replace conventional rockets, the dilemma only deepened. Could a weapon capable of annihilating entire cities truly be considered progress? Still, the legacy of World War II's rocket artillery wasn't purely destructive. It also marked the beginning of an extraordinary era of scientific exploration. The propulsion systems developed for military use laid the groundwork for the US and Soviet space programs. Von Braun's V-2 became the blueprint for the Redstone and Saturn rockets that would one day carry humanity to the moon. In a strange twist of fate, the same minds that once built weapons of terror now built vehicles of discovery. The roar that had once shaken Europe now echoed through Cape Canaveral and Baikonur, no longer as a herald of death but as the sound of human ambition breaking gravity's hold. But the shadow of war never disappeared completely. Every rocket that rose toward the heavens carried the memory of those that once fell to earth. The legacy of fear, innovation, and awe remained intertwined. In the decades that followed, museums across the world began preserving these wartime launchers. The Calliope stood in armored divisions as a relic of American ingenuity. The Katyusha became a symbol of Soviet endurance. The Nebelwerfer, once the tool of Nazi firepower, was studied and displayed as a reminder of how far the science of destruction had come and how easily it could return. To this day, when historians walk among those rusted tubes and twisted frames, they can almost hear it, the faint echo of a rocket's scream cutting through fog. It is a sound that belongs to another century, but its message is timeless. Progress and peril often share the same path. The story of World War II rocket artillery is not just about engineering or battle tactics. It is about the moment humanity discovered how to harness fire in ways even ancient warriors could never imagine, and how that discovery changed everything. When the German officers at the Ardennes first watched American rockets streak through the mist, they thought they were witnessing a new kind of weapon. They were right, but not just in a military sense. They were witnessing the birth of a new philosophy of warfare, a war that could be fought from miles away, a war that replaced the soldier's aim with a scientist's calculation, a war that turned fear itself into a weapon. From that point on, every army would strive not only to destroy the enemy, but to overwhelm him, to drown his courage in noise, fire, and shock. In that sense, the rockets of World War II were not merely weapons of steel and flame. They were symbols of a world entering an age where science and warfare became inseparable, where every new discovery carried both the promise of progress and the threat of ruin. And though decades have passed, their echoes remain. In the roar of modern rocket launchers, in the contrails of missiles, even in the peaceful rise of a space launch. Every ignition, every plume of fire is part of that same legacy. The men who fought beneath those screaming skies could never have imagined how their terror would give birth to technology that would one day touch the stars. But that is the paradox of human history. From destruction often comes creation. So when we look back at the rocket artillery of World War II, the Calliope's thundering launch, the Katyusha's wailing descent, the Nebelwerfer's smoke-filled trails, we are not just hearing the sound of battle. We are hearing the moment when mankind learned that power and fear could travel the same path, and that the trail of fire they leave behind would light the road to the future.